This morning, we are sort of preaching the Gospel Project tract of lessons today. When the kids were doing David, we did a page out of the Psalms. And today, in this month, in the last couple of weeks, the kids are talking about Solomon. And rather than tell the life story of Solomon, I wanted to talk about the wisdom literature in the Old Testament, which is so closely associated with Solomon. It's a strange series of books. It's unlike anything else in the New Testament or Old. It has some similarities with other things, but it's very much unique. Usually the book of Psalms is included, but we already covered that, so I can leave it out today. But normally the wisdom literature is Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. And we're going to cover 4 of those today and kind of what they mean and how you should read them. Obviously not every word, that would be a lot of material, but just a general sense of how to make sense of these. And the best way I can explain how you can read the wisdom literature of the Old Testament is to imagine that today we had a very special Sunday with guest speakers. And what I did was I invited 4 of my favorite preachers. I know this is a nightmare. We're going to get 4 sermons one Sunday. I invited 4 of my favorite preachers, and I said, I want you to preach to us today on the question, what is the most important lesson you have learned in your life? What is the meaning of life, and how do you live a good life? And so one at a time, the preachers come up to the podium, and the first guy he looks like a preacher. You know, he's got the preacher hair, and he's got the preacher look, and he's got the preacher suit. He's looking good. He looks like Blake Earnhardt preaching a wedding sermon. I mean, he is looking good, very sharp. Couldn't resist that today. And he gets up and he says, let me tell you what I've learned in my life. If you trust God and do what He says, everything works out. If you trust God and do what He says, your life goes better. If you trust God and do what He says, the trouble that falls on other people just misses you and lands on somebody else's head. There's a reason God's way is best, because it works. Because when you're honest, people tend to be honest to you. When you're kind, people tend to be kind to you. If you work hard, you get there early, and you stay late, and you do a good job, things go better than if you don't. And that's just true. And he sits down, and we all say, well, sounds pretty good. No arguments there. Then the next guy gets up. He looks a little more like me, unfortunately. He's a little more haggard. Looks like a guy who's watched 4 overtimes in an OU game on a Saturday. He's a little gray around the temples, threadbare suit. And he says, I would like to agree with everything my brother said today, but I just have to tell you my experience has been a little different. I think I've trusted God. I've been a minister all my life. I've tried to tell the truth. I've tried to work hard. But sometimes bad things happen anyway. And he says, you know, my wife got cancer, and we don't know why. And bad things happened to my relatives, and they were good people, but we don't know why. And I'd like to tell you that everything, if you just do right, it all works out. But I've noticed that sometimes in my life I suffer and I can't explain it. And I've had to figure that out and live with that. So the meaning of life is not do good and good things will happen. The meaning of life is sometimes you suffer and you have to learn from it and learn to embrace God in that. Well, this isn't as exciting a sermon as the last guy, but he sits down and we all kind of nod and say, okay. Third guy gets up. He is an old timer. I mean, like Bud Ross old. I mean, he gets up here, he's got his cane, and he walks up and he sits down an old worn Bible real heavy on the podium and flips it out and glares at us and says, I'll tell you what life is about. It's pointless, because you get old and you die. And it doesn't matter how good your life was, and it doesn't matter how much you suffered. It doesn't matter if you're rich or if you're poor. You get old and you die. And then he sits down. We're not thrilled with that one, but okay, we go along. Fourth guy gets up. He's a young man. Very young, attractive, handsome man, well-dressed in enthusiastic clothing. And he hops up in the podium with a skip in his step. He bounces around a little bit, and he says, that's just not true. Death isn't the most important thing about life. The most important thing about life is love. Love is what it's all about. And I'll tell you, I got married yesterday, and my life means something because of it. Last night was my wedding night, my honeymoon. Can I describe it to you? And he begins to tell us things that we find very uncomfortable on a Sunday morning. And I can feel the heat of the elders' glare on the back of my head that I've invited this young man to give us this talk. And he goes on, and it's really uncomfortable. And he talks about love and romance and sugary things, and we think, ugh. And then finally he says, but that's it. That's the meaning of life. Love. And he sits down. Okay, those were our 4 preachers this morning. Which one was right? Successful man, suffering man, old grumpy man, young man in love. Which one's right? The wisdom conversation of the Old Testament is very much like that, where you have 4 different legitimate answers to the same question. How do you live a good life? What's most important? And the truth is, none of them are true by themselves. That's the trick answer. It's not A, B, C, or D, it's E. None of the above. None of them are true by themselves. All of them are true together. If you just listened to one of those sermons and said, I'm going to live my life based on that, you wouldn't have actually a complete life. You're supposed to think about all those things together. So the wisdom literature of the Old Testament does that for you. It's a conversation between 4 points of view, all of which have part of God's truth in it. Right? They're all from God. Every word is true in its own right, but all of it also incomplete, which is why you need the other books. None of them are true by themselves. Each book is meant to be read and balanced by the others. And what happens is preachers preach one or the other. Blessed in these ways more often than not. They're not applicable to every situation. There's a passage in the Proverbs that says, raise a child in the way that they should go. When they're old, they'll not depart from it. And I have parents that'll bring that to me and say, I guess I didn't do it right. My kids, didn't stay faithful. And I always tell them 2 things. One, it says when they're old, doesn't mean they're going to stay there their whole lives, but one of these days they might come back around because you did a good job, better than you think. But 2, it's a proverb. It means that this is generally the case. If you raise them in the way that they should go, they're much more likely to come out well than if you raise them in the way they should not go. Right? Absolute truth there. If you want the opposite proverb, raise them up to be worthless sinners, and I can pretty well tell you how that story ends too. Right? So as a proverb, here's the general point. Raise them well, going to go a lot better than if you don't. When they're old, they'll not depart from it. That's what a proverb does. So the Proverbs are useful to us. They're the wisdom of success, of experience. It's the least, this is a philosophical thought here, but it's the least theistic of all the books of the Bible. What I mean by that is it's the least religious. You don't read the Proverbs and say, oh, there's the gospel, right? In fact, many of the things in Proverbs are affirmed by all the world's religions. There's one chapter in Proverbs, there's an ancient Egyptian document that quotes it verbatim. And we don't know which one came first. We don't know if Solomon stole it from Egypt or Egypt stole it from Solomon, right? But it's just true. No one disagrees with it. Work hard, get ahead. I mean, it's just true. And so that's what the Proverbs do for us. And everybody ought to ponder that. They're the voice of learning and experience. They set the baseline expectations for a healthy human life. The catch is, of course, as we've already hinted, they have exceptions. Or as the pirate said in Pirates of the Caribbean, they be more like guidelines than actual rules. Okay, and what we might call it the Job problem. The first chapter of Job introduces us to a Proverbs man. Remember what the text said? Fear God, this is the beginning of wisdom. Job 1:1 says, Job feared God and turned away from evil. So how should his life turn out? Like a wise man's life. It should be good. And yet, from 13 to 19 in that first chapter, he has the most horrific suffering of the Old Testament. Seems like a bad joke. It's just terrible. Everything bad happens to him, all at once. And he has these questions about what that means. We know, as the reader, kind of in the background, there's this other conversation going on. This being called Hasatan, the Satan, answered the Lord and said, does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face. What's he saying there? Well, of course Job follows you. You know why? Because Proverbs worked for him. He trusted you. He told the truth. He worked hard. He showed up early and stayed late. He did all the things he was supposed to do. He prayed for his family. He raised his kids well. And you blessed him. He's got wealth and ease and health and everything he wants. So, of course, he's happy. Does Job fear God for no reason? You paid him off. That's why he loves you. You gave him a bribe. God says, well, it's not true. And I'll show you. Take it all away and we'll see what happens. And so the story unfolds, and Job loses all of those things. All the Proverbs' blessings disappear from the Proverbs' life. And Job is troubled by that. And his three friends, three of the world's worst friends, Eliphaz and Zophar and Bildad, they come down and they start talking to Job. And they start basically quoting Proverbs to him. If you read the speeches given by the three friends, it sounds like it's right out of the book of Proverbs. When has the Lord ever punished a righteous man? Don't you know that if you do right, good things happen, Job? Your life's miserable, so let's do the math. We know how it's supposed to work out. If you're suffering, you must have done wrong. We've read our Proverbs. We know the story. And Job, then, is for us the challenging voice of suffering. Job says, no, I did the things I was supposed to do. If you can find something I did wrong, you show me the proverb I ignored, and I'll fix it. But I'm telling you, I don't know what I did. And it just kind of seems like God's out to get me, and I don't know why. And for chapter after chapter, they have that argument about the reality of real life suffering and then the idea of the Proverbs promise. So Job gives us the wisdom of suffering. Job, without a proverb to defend himself, has to find a way to have a relationship with God without the good sunny days of Proverbs to make it make sense to him. I got to tell you, that's wisdom we all need, because you're going to have those days. There are a lot of Proverbs days. Everybody hear me? I'm not complaining about the Proverbs. There are a lot of Proverbs days where working hard does get you ahead. But there are Job days too. And if you don't learn the wisdom of Job, you're unprepared for the other. You turn the page in your Bible and you get to the book of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes, written by a man simply called the preacher or the teacher, or in Hebrew, Kohelet. He is the master of wisdom, and he is a Proverbs master. He says so at the end of the book, chapter 12, 9 to 10. Besides being wise, I always want to start the sermon that way. Besides being wise, Besides being wise, the preacher also taught the people knowledge, weighing and studying and arranging many proverbs with great care. The preacher sought to find words of delight, and uprightly he wrote words of truth. Does the author of Ecclesiastes know the Proverbs? He says, folks, I wrote them. I know the Proverbs. I know how they're supposed to work out. I know how it's supposed to go. But now he's old. And things have changed. And life is getting to the end. And he realizes that those Proverbs, while they were helpful at times, do not change the way every human story ends. And so in chapter 1, 2, and 4, he says, vanity of vanities. The Hebrew word, havel, is emptiness, nothingness. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What does a man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? This is a different complaint than Job. The author of Ecclesiastes said, I did have a good life. I did do what I was supposed to do, and I did get ahead. And it still doesn't matter, because I'm going to die. I don't get to keep any of it. At the end of the day, I die. And death turns out to be the great equalizer. The wise man and the fool die. And no matter how successful you are in life, if you aren't prepared for the end of the story, your life hasn't been well lived. For both the wise man and the fool. And so the book of Ecclesiastes is the Bible's most cynical book. It's actually very difficult to read because you almost have to read it with a sneer, because sometimes he's kind of telling jokes. I mean, he's like, really, is that true? Haven't noticed. I mean, it's a brutal book to read. Chapter 12, 7 and 8 says, and the dust returns to the earth as it was, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. Vanities of vanities, says the preacher. It's all worthless. Is this true? Again, it is in its own right. That if you live your life and ignore the fact that someday you die, your life has not been well lived. I don't want us to all become cynical, right? I don't want us to be the grumpy man of Ecclesiastes, but he's got a point you have to hear. That at the end of the day, whether you are wise or a fool, this is the end of the story. That's the great equalizer. King Nebuchadnezzar and King Nebuchadnezzar's servant are in the same ground, in the same earth, buried, just eaten by the same worms. We all end up in the same spot. It's an equalizer, and if you're not prepared for that, in some way, then you haven't lived a good life at all. And that's the overall message of Ecclesiastes. The wisdom of death. It sounds cynical because we don't like to talk about death, but there it is. Death is that great equalizer. And I think a lot of modern culture wants to think about life without ever contemplating death. It's very uncomfortable. I'll tell you how uncomfortable it is. Let's see how you respond to this. I'm going to start next week a 13-week sermon series on death. Everyone excited? I think I'm going to have 5 people show up now. I mean, there's a reason we don't do that. Nobody wants to talk about it. I invited a guest speaker to fill in for me one time at a previous church, and he got up and preached a sermon on death. You know what I was told afterwards? Never have him back again. We don't want to talk about it. It's uncomfortable, but it's real. And it takes wisdom to contemplate that reality. Okay, what about that last one, though? That guy talking about his honeymoon, that guy wasn't really in the Bible, is he? Yeah, he is. It's super awkward. Okay. The book Song of Solomon starts like this. Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for your love is better than wine, your anointing oils are fragrant. Your name is oil poured out, therefore virgins love you. Draw me after you, let us run. The king has brought me into his chamber. And then it gets awkward, right? It gets stranger after this. When I do premarital counseling, I make them read this text in front of me because there's nothing like seeing young people blush in front of their preacher reading really awkward things out of the Bible. There it is. And so through Christian history, we've tried to reinterpret it as an allegory. Well, okay, it's not. I know it sounds like two people kissing and doing other things, but really it's about the bride of Christ, and it's an allegory. And that's all fine. I mean, allegories, if you want to make it true, sure. It can mean that. It absolutely can. That's not what it's about. It's really awkward. It's a romantic book. It's about two people passionately in love and going through it's like a musical number. There's a chorus that sings, and you expect people dancing through it, and there's a dream sequence. It's weird. And it's about young love. You know what's weird about young love? It's only great when you're young and in love. Like when old people see young people in love, we're like, just roll our eyes and think, yeah, you'll learn better. But when you're young and in love, is there anything more true than that? And the truth is, being less cynical for a moment, when you're old and in love, is there anything more true than that? Love is beautiful. It is meaningful. And so there's this line at the end of the book, after all the romance and weirdness. Notice I'm skipping all the parts I didn't want to read in the pulpit. Where it says, set me as a seal upon your heart, as a seal upon your arm, for love is strong as death. You see the reason that follows Ecclesiastes? Ecclesiastes says death is the great equalizer. Death is what you got to worry about. And Song of Solomon ends with, there's something that's at least as strong as death. Love is strong as death. Jealousy fierce as the grave. Its flashes are flashes of fire, the very flame of the Lord. Where does love come from? Proverbs says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Song of Solomon says love comes from God. God invented marriage. God invented love. God invented sex. God gave that as a gift to man. It's apparently a good thing. And it says it in a way that's super awkward, but still true. Love means something. It's an answer to Ecclesiastes. Yeah, you're going to die, but if you lived a life and you loved, can you face death differently? And it means something. If a man offered love for all the wealth of his house, he would be utterly despised. What would you trade for actual love? That's the conversation going on, and you're not supposed to take any one of them by themselves. All of them mean something. Which leads me then to today's conversation. The song says love is from God and gives value to life. Ecclesiastes says death is the great equalizer. Job says suffering, that's what it's all about. Proverbs says do well and you'll do well. Okay, thank you. Now what? How does a Christian think about wisdom? And I'm grateful that Paul has already preached this sermon for me. Because what Paul tells us in the New Testament is wisdom is great and you should have lots of it. But if you think the meaning of life will be found in picking a philosophical school, saying that's my wisdom book and I'm going to do that one really well, or that you can think your way through wisdom to a good life, you will have also missed the point. That wasn't what the wisdom conversation was about. Wisdom is about a life well lived. And once there was a man who lived that life. Listen to 1 Corinthians then, chapter 1. For the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. That at the end of the day, God encourages wisdom to a degree, right? It's in His book. There's wisdom literature. You're supposed to live a better life. You don't have to be a fool. But you're not supposed to convince yourself that if you think about it really hard, you will perfect human living. We were supposed to look somewhere else. Someone was going to have to show us what that looked like. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of the age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. An interesting acknowledgement there. Yes, it could have been the case that you learned all wisdom came from God and that through the pursuit of wisdom you found God, but it hasn't worked out that way. As a general rule, humans have done a terrible job of that. And so, since we did not know God through wisdom, God says, I'm going to give you another way to know me. And it has pleased Him to do it. For Jews demand signs and Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, the stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles, but to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. The Bible, the New Testament's wisdom literature is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The New Testament's wisdom literature is look at the life of this man. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. He continues in the next chapter. He's not even done. And I, when I came to you, brothers, did not come proclaiming to you the testimony of God with lofty speech or wisdom, for I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. Yet among the mature we do impart wisdom. Nobody ever reads that verse, by the way. He doesn't say wisdom's a bad thing. He doesn't even say philosophy's a bad thing. I like philosophy. He says you just got to know where to get it. Yet among the mature we do impart wisdom, although it is not a wisdom of this age or of the rulers of this age who are doomed to pass away. But we impart a secret and hidden wisdom of God, which God decreed before the ages for our glory. None of the rulers of this age understood this, for if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. How do you know that the rulers of this age were not wise? They killed wisdom. They crucified the man who was the incarnation of the wisdom of God for us. They put him to death. That's how we know they weren't wise, and they're still doing it. And so are we. So Paul says, let's look to that man and see the wisdom of God. Christ is the wisdom of God, the perfection of every proverb. Christ is the suffering servant Job. Christ is acquainted with death. He passed through it and conquered death. Christ is the triumph of love. He is everything in the wisdom conversation, lived out and balanced perfectly in one human life so that we could know God by Him and His wisdom. Would you bow with me in a word of prayer? Our Father and our God, we are fools, and we come to you acknowledging our foolishness. We need wisdom, and we need to recognize that it comes from above. Help us to pursue the wisdom you have given to us in the person of your Son, Jesus Christ, who knows what it means to flourish and be wise, to suffer, to die, and to love. And help us to do all those things in him. Forgive us our foolish ways as we turn to your wisdom, in whose name we pray. Amen.